if you're happy to, I can tell you the Indo-European creation myths, in effect. I haven't told this story for ages, if you want.
Yes, you can. And I've enjoyed every iteration you've put out.
Okay, so I hope I can remember it. But why I'm telling you this, and one of the things I do, in case people do not realise, is it's something we've actually said. I run a database called the Mythology and Folklore database, and it is a database of motifs, and they're aligned to different traditions around the world. And we've got about 200,000 narratives in there. 200,000 stories. Some are very similar, almost the same. And we can use that to understand where stories come from. So, in the beginning, many cosmoses have no light, have nothing. Gununga of sorts, if that is what that means, we're not entirely sure. And so, out of nothingness came two primordial beings, twins, male twins, and we shall call them Manu, meaning man, and Yimo, meaning twin. And there also seems to have been a primordial cow. And they're floating through space, and as time passes or doesn't pass, because he may not have been created at this point, other gods and deities form, and everybody's wandered in this chaotic mess, and Manu and Yimo agree that they need to settle, need to stop. And so Yimo agrees to sacrifice himself to create a home for Manu and to create the order amongst things. So Yimo is sacrificed, and from his body the world is created by Manu. And Manu drops a giant primordial cow on the world, and that creates more cows and animals. And what he does with the body, we often see this, and we see it in the Old Norse text. From the bones, he creates rocks, hair, he creates grass, blood, he creates sea and water. At the eyes come be the sun and the moon.
So I would say, Jon, thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to meet you all.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I don't know if you would like to let our audience know exactly what time is it over there.
So it's now 12 minutes past 2 in the morning. Far too late or early to be doing this usually, but as a tea lover, I am now wide awake. Our form of coffee full of caffeine.
Right. Well,
yes.
Cheers.
We definitely commend you for such an early interview, or late, depending on how you look at it. So I thank you for that. If you don't mind, some of our viewers may not be so familiar with your work. Just kind of a brief introduction, who you are, where maybe they can find some more of your content, and what brought you along to this study.
Okay, so I'm Jon F White. I run a YouTube channel called Crecganford, where I try and teach people about mythology and try and discuss religion as well, and why people believe, which is interesting because I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a man of faith. So I'm doing it in a very academic way. And the reason I am here is because I got really frustrated at listening to people, especially those of what I consider Germanic or Old Norse type belief, putting things on the internet that were just nonsense. I felt something needed to be done about this because I've studied Old Norse and Anglo-Saxon literature, and although that was so long ago now, I forgot most of it. But yeah, I just felt I needed to say something, and as I've done that, people have liked what I've done there, and I've expanded that to cover primarily Indo-European sources. So in effect, the ancestor languages, beliefs, and cultures of the Norse and the Germanic, which is a great way of understanding the source of myths and why the myths exist to those cultures you're interested in. as well as other cultures in the Indo-European landscape.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Yeah, for someone that's a true fan of your channel and seen a whole lot of your content, I appreciate you actually stepping in and helping to educate others who may have had perverted idea of how the old ways kind of were due to, I guess maybe just bad interpretations of such, or just a skewed aspect.
Modern media.
Right.
Yeah, miseducation or unrevised information. So yeah, and we could talk about that where that initial path took me, which was quite a deep, dark place.
I mean,
so yeah, we'll start off with that.
Go for it. Yeah.
If you're okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as I say, there are people with beliefs and there were biases in there and things being said that weren't great. So I tried to connect to these people, which got me into a lot of trouble because it made everybody believe that I was one of these people. But I ended up talking to people who wrote the literature for these organisations, and it became very clear to me that they were driven to that religion in the same way as people in other religions. Just as someone who's deeply Christian or believed in Christ and the Bible, there were people there who believed in that way, in the old ways, who took what people had written 50 years ago as absolutely faith. And the trouble with, truth, let's call it truth, because we've discussed this a lot. Because what people don't necessarily understand is, or may not realise, is that myths are stories with truths in them, normally sacred truths. And sacred truths don't have to be facts. So, for example, many people would say that Odin may not have existed. Is that a truth or is it a fact? And the same with Jesus. Did Jesus exist? Is that a truth or a fact? But some people go through and believe that Jesus was real, and that's their truth, irrespective we can't prove it. So it was very interesting seeing that, and very interesting seeing people try to reconstruct religion, and like sort of Germanic religion, Old Norse religion, and do things. I saw someone wanted to do a sacrifice, and they put a packet of ham or something on a tree stump. And I'm like, now, I say I'm not religious myself, and who am I to judge? But to buy a packet of processed food in a plastic container and stick it on a tree stump doesn't feel like, if I was a god, I'd be like, thanks very much. I mean, there's probably maybe a good thought behind it, and that's what they're doing it for, but there was far too much worship and reverence of the gods. There's a quote that no one loved their god in either. They weren't there necessarily to be worshipped. I went down there, and the result of that is some people did listen to what I said in terms of the information they were reading and using was wrong. But most of them now don't talk to me and cut themselves off for me. But I say, hopefully some of them have listened and have amended their ways. But that was a really interesting dive into people in certain religious organisations, almost doing it to be part of that organisation and to be part of the camaraderie and the feeling one gets for being a Viking sort of thing. I don't know how you can sort of add that up, but there's a lot of that, the last 10 years or so. And they weren't doing it for the right reason. And so, that's how I really started off with YouTube, just to try and get in touch with those people and work out why. Why do you believe that? And when I found out, it's just obvious. There's some very old people who are quite well read in very old texts writing this stuff. But the information I have now is so out of date, and they themselves haven't necessarily been taught about the theology behind these things. So it's really just reading a bit of Tacitus and misinterpreting it. And so that's where I am. And so after that, people wanted, for my own well-being, I should change direction a little bit, and the people who are watching my videos wanted to know more, and that's where I dived into the roots of the myths we see in things like the Eddas, to say where they came from, and people really appreciated that. And if you understand the root of some of the stories of the Eddas, they make a lot more sense.
Yes, most definitely. And that gets into the understanding. So I thank you for, I guess, being forefront in that original, the changing of the mindset of others. Yes, a lot of people take these things, whether it's an Abrahamic faith or an animistic faith or any, in between, quite literally. And whether it's, died on the world tree, they're thinking that, a man was actually nailed to a tree to sacrifice self to self, or the other side of that coin, we'll say, where, Jesus lived and died in, these locations. When we look at things through an outside perspective, you could see, say, the disciples more as the months or the moons, and that, that they followed Jesus, who died and stayed dead for 3 days before arising into the skies, more of the solstice and the rebirth fact. Or something like the Odin, will say, hanging from the world tree for 9 months. And we spoke about this recently as more of the child hanging from the placenta, and then the roots reach down into, a history that no man knows. It could go all the way back to ancestral before modern day human has even become a thing, say, to ancient man, prior to, say, 30,000 BC and stuff.
Okay. I would challenge that, but I don't really want to go down that route just yet. We could go straight into Thor hanging from the tree, which is one of the big ones. But we can certainly talk about the origin of belief, or what people don't necessarily understand about the core values of belief, if you want. Which paint some context for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And if
if
anybody else wants to chime in with a different direction before we get so deep in the weeds, by all means, go right ahead.
Okay. So I think what I'm about to say is quite important for anyone who has a faith outside the Abrahamic faiths. And that is that those faiths, particularly those we regard as heathenry, are very nature-focused. We look at the world around us and want to be sort of one with the world. But people don't really get necessarily why or what it means. And the reason for that is we have lost the sacred nature of things. We don't understand it in society anymore, or certainly in Western society, I'll call it. So Indo-European society almost. And the reason for that is that it is down to Christianity primarily, and then the Renaissance, you could argue. But what the Abrahamic religions did were two things. One, they created a Bible, a set of stories that many of which were borrowed from other religions and cultures, which they don't mention, but they get this, and it is a canonical story. It is a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It isn't something that you can read again and again. It isn't repeated like a year is repeated. The cycle's repeated. So that comes in, and and we get that because you have that, you stop worshipping the year. Because the year, you're no longer worried about sort of the annual cycle of things. You're worried about, the story is Jesus was born, Jesus did some stuff which we don't know about for 30 years, suddenly pops up for a couple of weeks, and then, gets arrested and put on the cross and dies and raised a few days later. But then that is that. He doesn't come back. He's meant to come back, but he seems to be lacking in that, my understanding. And so, because that was pushed, those who believe that no longer had these need to have this yearly cycle to worship the summer or the winter. We just worship Jesus coming and then dying, and that's it. And I think if you understand that and can put that to one side, and and understand it and then forget it, you can then understand actually what was there before, and it was the cycle of the seasons, the cycles of the moon. And that is why they are important. That is what drove our life. We did those things every year because that was our way of making the world go around. And we had certain rituals and practices and beliefs which were touched on that made that world go round for particular reasons. We had a cosmogony. This is how the cosmos came to be, and this is how it ends and recycles, and that's what it is. So I think understanding that is probably, I think, one of the most important things to realise about modern day society, why it all seems so sterile or so uninterested. It is that many people are just brought up in the modern way of things, that actually the cycle of the year isn't anywhere near important. We're so removed from it, we just don't see it. So yeah, that's. I just wanted to say that before we dived into.
Yeah, absolutely.
I completely agree with everything that you said on that front. I've mentioned this on the channel before, but you may not know this, John, for what it is. I'm going to give very brief from my background and that kind of stuff. My father's side was mainly agnostic and or atheist. So, they had that going on that. My father switched between agnostic and deitist his whole life in terms of his worldview. I think he's finally settled on deitist. I think his main thing against religion is that he doesn't like organized religion and what it happens when that comes into it, basically. My mother's side, one of my grandparents was Catholic and one of them was Protestant. My mother converted to Hinduism/Vedism before I was even born. And I was dragged along to those events starting at about a month old and kept going all the way up until my mid-20s. And so what you're saying there basically makes it so I get to see got to see a living pagan/heathen tradition, if you will, that goes all the way back and ties directly into this Indo-European stuff. And I've gotten to understand both worldviews intimately well because of that, if you will, the main ones that have come out of Western civilization, and then or the old time one that you're talking about there, and everything you said really resonated with me because of that.
That's good. That's good. I'm not talking nonsense. That's good.
So quickly, when you spoke about this seasonal stuff and worshipping the summer, worshipping in winter, there's some evidence of that in the Norse. I've got Baldur is I think the most clear, but it's pretty deep riddled within the symbolism. Is there anything else in the other Indo-European religion mythologies that maybe have an even more clear example of that seasonal worship and really rituals that follow the cycles?
In terms of the sun and the moon, not specifically. So most people, when they think of the Germanic and Old Norse, they consider that they came from the Indo-Europeans, and then the Amnara culture came in and came to this part of the world, and that was a pastoral farming society. It was about cows. It wasn't necessarily about agriculture, and it was the agricultural type farmers who had these more seasonal, like certainly the sun worship and going to the underworld and coming back, than the pastoral farmers. So what we're really seeing when we talk of Baldur is the Near Eastern myths have arrived in Scandinavia and Germania, those regions, before the pastoral farmers, and they were so good that they persisted. And they were kept on within the Old Norse, which does shock a number of people who like to think of themselves as Indo-Europeans. But equally, I can then go to the Near East and show you, actually, they've stolen our cattle, or the Indo-European, call it out because I'm Indo-European, they stole the Indo-European cattle raiding myth in the Bible and some of our creation cosmogony as well. We see that in Christian worship, certainly in Russia and Eastern Europe. So there are a mixture of stories, and then you've got to start asking yourself, why have particular stories been kept from cultures that you wouldn't necessarily consider your root ancestral culture, that has the beliefs you want to follow? Yeah, and that opens up all sorts of questions, because what are you trying to do in practicing your belief? Are you trying to just understand why your ancestors believed a particular thing? Are you trying to reconstruct something? Are you trying to evolve it for the modern day? And all of these will have implications on how you practice your faith. Is there change things? So yes, so that was sort of answering that question about the sun worship. You'll find that this cycle of the sun is more of a Near Eastern belief, and that's why that's there. And I don't really recall any specific sun-moon worship in the European culture. Wow. They did have a sun god, and they did see the moon as having certain properties, but I don't think they were necessarily part of the cycle because they were more pastoral farmers. And the Baldur story is interesting, and it's been looked at as whether it was a later introduction by some. That some people think it's a Christian-influenced thing, and Balder being sort of a Christian figure, but you can actually see that story in some of the older texts. Saxo Grammaticus's work has a story in it. It's a sort of different story in a way. It's got some really interesting things that come out of that as well. If you look at it. So it is truly an old story, but it is, I believe, of Near Eastern origins. Much like you'd argue that, with her cats could well be more of a Near Eastern origin story, because cats came from the Near East, and you don't expect them necessarily in Scandinavia at the time. This sort of imagery was put there. They must have been there for some time. So yeah, we mustn't forget that there will be influence from outside the Indo-European sphere of things on your beliefs, or on the beliefs of your ancestors.
Yeah, I can definitely see why, when you start talking about your research, that people in these spheres get maybe a bit pushed away in a way, because it's quite challenging, especially for a lot of people who consume the modern media and want to think that this is a purely isolated culture that developed, like the Norse culture, even it developed independently, and all of its mythology is self-contained, and it does create a challenge. But that's one of the things I think that I try to impart to people, is that one of the great things about their culture at the time was that they actually were pretty observant individuals and looked at what worked, and then took that and brought that with them. But also touching on what you said, or how you mentioned the how Jesus came in to the North and everything, and how that had an influence, or how to influence cultures outside of a cycle worship. It gave me a whole new perspective. And actually, that's actually what I named my son after, was the worship of cycles and everything. And I think really right now what's happening is that people are experiencing a lot of the amount of information that's out there, like your channel itself, and getting a lot more perspective, where they're not just limited to what's in their community. They're getting so much more perspective that people are starting to move backwards into this sort of thing, because there must be some sort of resonant message there that they feel, and certainly I feel that. I think most people do.
Yeah, so I mean, you have to ask why people are religious and why they believe a certain thing. Sometimes it's social, sometimes it is that they want some meaning, a purpose. There's all sorts of things that drive that, and you want to be, once you're in there, you want to be doing it for the right reason. You don't want to necessarily just follow a crowd of people because they believe it. You should really think, actually, what do I need? And I think that's very important, because certainly as we go back in time, this sort of model of worship as we see in the Abrahamic religions just didn't exist in paganism and heathenry, not to that extent. Yes, certainly near the Mediterranean there were temples and things like that, but from what we can tell in across Europe, is temples were a far later addition to the world, and as were the sort of figurative decorations and things like that. That's why if we do find temples, there's very little there to tell us about the gods. They didn't have too many objects that they considered to be venerated, to be, no one had Thor's hammer. I'm sure if the Christian church had Thor's hammer, Christ wielded Mjolnir, you'll have 5 or 6 churches across Europe having a piece of Thor's hammer in their churches. So there's a real different view of why that is. And I sort of touched on it earlier, is that pagans, and certainly the heathens of northwestern Europe, didn't worship gods like you see Abrahamic people in Abrahamic religions worship gods today. They didn't. They just didn't do that. I mean, gods weren't like that. Gods were. I tend to look at them as, well, I like Jackson Crawford talks about them as being like personalities or figures, but I look at them as goals, as someone you want to be. You would like to emulate Thor, or you'd like to emulate Freya, or you like to emulate Odin. Be more like them. That's what you wanted to achieve, because they were, as good as immortal. If they reached that stage and then that's good, then that should be where you want to be. I mean, there's one piece of poetry I talk about, which was by Watkins, when he reconstructed Indo-European. He got this phrase that fame does not decay, which basically means do well in life and people will sing songs about you. You'll be in the poetry, you'll be remembered, and that is what should drive you. You should be the best person you want to be. You don't, you shouldn't follow the crowd or whatever. You shouldn't spend your life in the humble service of a god. You be the best person you want to be. And that's really important. And I think if you understand that, that isn't existed in today's society, not in a spiritual way, as far as I can tell, not for most people, but if you yourself believe in those gods and you go back in time, you think that's nature driven and I'm meant to be the best person I want to be, there's a really good feeling about that. Even for someone like me who isn't necessarily religious, I feel there is almost power in that. And that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Honestly, I definitely love that. Like, again, getting away from the literalism and getting back more towards the natural side of stuff, that cyclic, but the cycle of not only just nature, but the life and death cycle. Well, that's also on a earthbound ways, the different seasons, things die, things go into hibernation during these cold months. These different gods, or we'll say, are venerated or worshipped to a higher extent. Even the gods themselves, we'll say, which could be looked at more as attributes than a physical form, could be the attribute, say, of a spring or a season, or like the fury or something that someone is physically possessing. But yeah, even these things can be looked at as more of a cycle of things. You're not always angry, you're not always happy, but there's a cycle between those. And like during childbirth, we are elated, we are happy. You might look towards this god or goddess for the health and well-being of this thing, while if my mother passes, I might look towards this one for her care in the afterworld.
Okay, so yeah, there's a couple of things you can go there. So I think one thing that comes out to me when reading all these ancient texts is that we aren't meant to be happy for the downfall of things. I mean, yes, we can be joyous about things, but to try and be happy, if you think about it, is really, really hard. Too hard. It will make you sad trying to be happy. Don't be happy. Just get rid of the chaos from your life. And you sort of hear about that in the stories. If you get rid of all the chaos in your life, you're left with what should be regarded as happiness, even though you're not joyous, like having a baby or whatever things make you joyous, whether it's bringing in a crop or buying a Lamborghini, depending on the kind of person you are. It's just having no stress in your life is the best place to be. Absolutely. But I want to talk about the cycle of things, because we talk about that, because that's really important. I mean, it is the driver for much of the belief. So if you're happy to, I can tell you the Indo-European creation myth, in effect. I haven't told this story for ages, if you want.
Yes, you can. And I've enjoyed every iteration you've put out.
Okay, so I hope I can remember it. But why I'm telling you this, and one of the things I do, in case people do not realise, is it's something we've actually said. I run a database called the Mythology and Folklore database, and it is a database of motifs, and they're aligned to different traditions around the world. And we've got about 200,000 narratives in there, so 200,000 stories. Some are very similar, almost the same. And we can use that to understand where stories come from. We can see how they're spread across the world. And by looking at the language of the stories and where they're told, and our knowledge of human dispersal and our knowledge of linguistic evolution, we can create a probabilistic model to say, actually, looking at all this story probably started in this place in the world. Okay, and about this time. And that's really useful. And we can use that, and we can find many stories that have travelled from Eurasia into the Americas, which must have happened during the last ice age, where there was a ice sheet across Thuringia, okay, so from northeastern Russia and the Serbian area into North America. And so you think about that, wow, that's really old stories. But then we get stories that are literally everywhere around the world that we wouldn't necessarily consider archetypes, so natural thought process, but a natural proper story with specific plot points in it that are repeated, and we can say, oh, that story's actually probably come from Africa over 70,000 years ago. And there are some skeptics, and I can go into the boring maths of it all. In fact, you probably have to watch my channel to do that rather than send you all to sleep, because it's now about 2:30 in the morning for me, and that will really do me in if I talk about that. I do have this.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions, but we'll say maybe you and I
Yeah,
talk about it at one point later.
I've given abbreviated view, but there is a scientific process behind the understanding of the age and source of myths. This isn't guesswork. This isn't whatever. We have real data, and we have lots of real data. And this data is used by universities across the world. And I spend quite a chunk of my time talking to various universities across the world about doing research with that data to understand, origins of myths. It's a fantastic job, and I have to thank my patrons who, most of their support goes into delivering that database. It has really changed how we study mythology in the last few years. So that is why I feel I'm able to talk about what I'm about to talk about, which is the Indo-European creation myth, because we can take the myths told around the Indo-European landscape from India and Persia to Scandinavia and Italy and Greece, and hints of it in Armenia and other primary sources. Using all this information, we can, like we've reconstructed the Proto-Indo-European language, we can reconstruct a creation myth. Okay, but this is all probabilistic. So what I'm going to tell you is probably a version that was quite like the original. It's not the exact words of the original, but it gives you an idea of what was going on. And then we can pull that apart, and you may have many questions at this point. So in the beginning, many cosmoses have no light, have nothing. Gununga gap of sorts, if that is what that means. We're not entirely sure. And so out of nothingness came two primordial beings, twins, male twins, and we shall call them Manu, meaning man, and Yimo, meaning twin. And there also seems to have been a primordial cow with them. And they're floating through space, and as time passes or doesn't pass, because he may not have been created at this point, other gods and deities form, and everybody's wandered in this chaotic mess, and Manu and Yimo agree that they need to settle, need to stop. And so Yimo agrees to sacrifice himself to create a home for Manu and to create the order amongst things. So Yimo is sacrificed, and from his body, the world is created by Manu. Manu drops a giant primordial cow on the world, and that creates more cows and animals. And what he does with the body, we often see this, and we see it in the Old Norse text. From the bones, he creates rocks, hair, he creates grass, blood, he creates sea and water. The eyes can be the sun and the moon. We have this homology, I think it was called by Lincoln, of body parts creating the world. And then Manu comes down to the world as a priest figure. And in this priest figure form, he then decides to create people. And from the leftover parts of Yimo, from the head, he creates a priest or other priests. From the torso, he creates warriors. And from the legs, he creates providers or farmers. And then he realizes he hasn't got a king. Yimo was his brother, his elder brother in effect, and was king of the cosmos. So he has to create a king. And so he creates a king from all parts of Yimo's body. And that works because if a king is made up of all the parts of everyone else, he should be able to understand everyone else. But also, and this is absolutely brilliant, because he's made up of all parts of the world, he's also part of the world. And so if the world becomes sick, the king becomes sick. And if the king becomes sick, the world becomes sick. So the king is the land and the land is the king. And you can hear that in other myths too. And so we have people on the world and animals on the world, and all is wonderful. And Manu, in his priestly role, teaches people that through sacrifice, the cosmos can stay in order. And so what this means is that, and it can go deeper into this if you want, but basically, if you sacrifice a living being, normally a cat, piece, bovine or bovine at this time, but it does change, you can, in effect, give back to the universe, and the gods are happy, and they make more animals and life. But what is really happening is that by killing a living being, and this was human, we do have evidence suggesting this was sometimes human, which is why you don't want to reconstruct religious practice or you will be arrested within the fortnight. But in effect, if you sacrifice someone, their bones go back into being rocks, their blood goes back to being water, their hair goes back to being grass. And in fact, you're replenishing the earth so that people can be born again. Because when someone's born, they take soil from the earth and water from the sea and grasses from the land to create their body. So that disappears. So you have to, in effect, there is a natural cycle of things, of life and death, to keep the world going. And that is the basic, very high level cosmogony of that because the world is created from Yimo and people are created from Yimo, that there is a natural cycle here at many different levels. So a cosmic level to create the world, at a microcosmic level to for people. And that's I think it's an absolutely clever story and a very interesting how they thought of that process. So that is the nature of things, and that is a cyclical process that you don't see in the more modern monotheistic religions.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a beautiful way of pointing that out to everyone, whether it's here or viewers at home today. The cycle of life, the sacrifice, the rebirth, the giving back.
I would say that actually, in your video discussing, I believe it was one of the Celtic regions, you bring a lot of that back into it, and as some of their justification when talking about, I believe, like the Druids and so forth. When the
Romans,
I was trying to remember exactly which ones, but they invaded and they were observing this, right? They were observing this and trying to make sense of all this kind of stuff, but. Yeah, it's something that's gone into every Northern European type of culture and perhaps even further than that. But yeah, I mean, you still see remnants of that even to this day. It's so incredibly powerful and fundamental to like the psyche of a human being and their understanding of the world.
Yeah, in fact, to possibly blow your mind about this a little bit, is that
Please do.
now when you're all American, and there's nothing wrong with that, I'm not going to...
I just put on a really good accent.
Okay, so when you're all sitting down to perhaps Thanksgiving dinner, which you may do, because you still practice what the society likes practicing, you are in effect repeating this sacrificial moment. You will find there be someone, the person who carves the turkey tends to be the head of the household, the chief of the land. You tend to serve the food in order of the most important guests first. Now, you may think that's just polite, but that is literally what was happening when you sacrifice something. You then dished it out in very precise parts. You gave the head to the important people. You gave the torso to those who are the fighters and the warriors. You gave the legs to those farmers. And then when you carve it out, you might give, the turkey legs to your kids or something, and the breast to your friends, whatever. So, there's an interesting fact that actually some of these rituals, although you may argue that you can't really prove it, there's a direct link there, but there's enough ritual in there. And I made a video about this on human sacrifice. And again, it was Lincoln who had discovered an old British, well, you want to call it an elite establishment, but that's the whole point, it wasn't. But an establishment that called like the British Beef Eating Society, of beef eaters or something, and everybody turned up and they were all dressed the same. There was meant to be no hierarchy in it until you sat down at the dinner table and you saw how they served. And it was served in a particular order, and then you realise actually underneath the uniform, society needs a hierarchy to keep things in order. So they were incredibly interesting. But that's the premise of it. And so this idea of the body creating the world gets reflex in Christianity. So we see something called the Dove poem, I think it's called, which I don't think there's an English version yet, but there will be, because it's something I've wanted to translate for years, which actually shows that Jesus was created from the universe. So his eyes were the sun and the moon, and his hair came from the grass, and his blood came from the sea. So like he is created, that's like the king of Indo-European myth. And you see this, that's in Enoch as well. I think Enoch, second book of Enoch in the Abrahamic religion, which is probably a couple of thousand years old. So this idea has permeated, across cultures outside of the Indo-Europeans as well. So that I find that incredibly interesting. And then if you go, what you find is that when the Indo-Europeans and the Yamnaya culture sort of spread out, it done it in two specific ways in terms of what we understand, because we can see the language change. We see what we call a kentum-satum split in terms of the dialect they speak, and we find that there are slightly different myth types and beliefs in those who speak those slightly different dialects. So you can see an age difference of that. So the older kentum language, they talk about the fair man of the dead, and then have this as a passage into death. But the Satums don't. They have a more of a modern day and spiritual understanding. You'll find that particularly in sort of the Persia, going down into India, and actually in India, it became so spiritual that the cow that was sacrificed became, in effect, a sacred object. So you couldn't sacrifice it anymore. And that's why the cow in Hindu myth is sacred. It's come from the original Indo-European thought.
One of the incarnations of Vishnu.
Yeah, so and then this is just an interesting question about where is Manu and Yimo now in our stories? If they are so important in creation and primordial beings, where are they? And you have Romulus and Remus for Rome. We can show that they come from Manu and Yimo. We can see Yama and Manu in the Vedic texts, although people argue they're slightly different roles, but that will change. The Vedic texts are written probably 3,000 years after this story is being told in the form I told it, so things do tweak. But what is really interesting, and this may cause conversation, I don't know if you've heard me talk about this in my videos, is that where are Manu and Jiro in the Old Norse stories? You have Odin, Vili and Ve sacrificing Ymir, and there is a cow there. And they think, yeah, there's some similarity to the creation myth, but Ymir isn't Ymo. Well, Ymir probably means double or twin or two, and if Ymo was a twin figure, it's more than coincidence. There's an alignment in what the meaning of the word. But then we've got this cow, but where is Manu? Where is the man? We see Tacitus mention Manu when he talks about the Germanic tribes in his Germania text. And my view is that Odin replaced Manu, because Manu was the priest figure, and he killed Ymir to create the world, and Odin is the priest figure. He is all knowledge, and he kills Ymir. So I think at some point Odin has replaced Manu. So there's something to think about.
Are you familiar with the trimurti idea in Hinduism?
Well, yeah, we see the tripartite in Indo-European.
Yeah, of course. To me, when I'm looking at it, when it talks about those three gods that are there, and sometimes it has different names depending upon the story, of course, the poem, of course, but that they all just represent one of those three things. And ultimately, they're all part of, at least in Hinduism in particular and whatnot, of one higher god, in this case, Brahman, and that kind of thing with it. And so, in my opinion, it would probably be all three combined are originally part of that Manu figure for what it is. And they're just taking on that same role that came from it at that point. That's kind of how I was looking at it when I was first reading and exposed to these stories. That they are just, since they all give parts of themselves in order to create man later on, like the actual humanity.
Yes, that may be part of it, because the Rig Veda is quite an interesting text to interpret. There are some good, there's one really good translation out there of it. And this is another big problem we have with foreign texts, is that it's okay someone saying they can translate it, and we've got AI systems that can translate things now, but you have to interpret them as well. And when you interpret, let's say the Prusa hymn, that is 1090 in the Rig Veda, that talks of this story, but it talks of Purusa, but Purusa is really the Manu Yimo story. Going on to the Purusa's being cut up, the world is made out of him. So yeah, the story does change, but it is quite interesting. And then you've got to ask, actually, does that mean Vili and Ve are part of Odin and part of Manu? Or, I have my own theories on who Vili and Ve are. That's a tunnel we can go down, or journey we can venture at some point. So that's an understanding of why that creation myth is there. Now, if you read the Prose Edda, which you should take with a large pinch of salt, because there is stuff in there we absolutely have confidence in that Snorri Sturluson made up. So certain motifs in there. He talks about then when Ymir is killed, the blood floods the world, and in effect, you almost get a Noah's Ark story, and that certainly feels very Christian syncretic in there in terms of that story. So you do have to be a little careful there. But so this is why you hear a lot of people talk about going to the Poetic Edda as the primary source. And the reason for that, so when we study myth, we do that, is because that before we wrote things down, we had to remember these stories. And the easiest way to remember stories, if you can't write them down, is to sing them in a tune, a song. So that is why all our earliest primary sources tend to be poems. All across the world in religious texts, from the Indo-European of the Mesopotamians to the Rig Veda to the Poetic Edda to the Anglo-Saxon text. 99% of it's poetry because it's just repeating it. So that is why we have confidence that they are the earliest texts, but also because they are poetry, whilst it isn't impossible, it's a lot harder to change poetry and to make it make sense. And if you do change it, you can see actually someone's changed that. And we do notice that in the Poetic Edda, there are lines in there that don't fit the meter, don't fit the rhythm, and we wonder, why have they been changed? So
I will say just a moment, Crow needs to hop out of here, and I just wanted to make sure that she got to be able to say or speak anything.
Yep. I just wanted to say thank you very much, Mr. White. I really appreciate all of the work that you put in, all of the research you put in, all the stuff you share out with the world out there. We've been together just this time, and my mind's already like thinking in different ways, and I love that. I love to learn. Absolutely love to learn. I dove into your channel because we were having you on as a guest and stuff, and I've spent a lot of hours.
Well, thank you.
But I just wanted to say before I left that I very much appreciate all the honorable work that you're doing here, and it was great to get to chat with you.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Just a moment before you get back into that, and not to be rude and interrupt you or anything like that, but I just found your story so compelling. And when we were talking about the relation to the king and the land, you certainly see that in so many different cultures, right? I mean, you see that in Arthurian legend. Nathaniel could absolutely attest to that, I believe.
Yeah.
It's his area of study. But it's interesting now because there's a phrase that says that the average man these days lives the life of luxury similar to a king, right? So it's neat to think that there's this like uprising of thought returning to people that the land's actually still there, even after all this industrial work that's happened in the world and this disconnection from it. And I believe that there's a phrase going around that, like, what you do to the land, you do to yourself. And I think that people are starting to wake up and realize that. And I think hearing your story there definitely shows that, I don't know, like it's almost like a genetic memory, I think, that's coming back into society. And especially if that's one of the earliest perspectives that we've had, or one of the earliest stories to unite the human and land and like what we are here with our consciousness and what our duty and responsibility is here, right? Like, why do we have this consciousness? Why do we exist? And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess that's more of a spiritual rather than academic question, but I think it poses really, really interesting concepts for people who try to find purpose in their history and their relation to the earth and all the years and decades and everything that's passed by. So I just want to say, I just thought that was a really compelling story.
Thank you. It's this, unfortunately, it's not my story. It's the Indo-Europeans. And the thing is, they didn't just make it up. You know, that story probably had been created over thousands of years. And it's created over thousands of years because the land was important to them, because they understood that. And certainly when they had a more sedentary lifestyle, so they settled down, stopped being hunter-gatherers, you have to take far more care of the land you're on. You can't just move somewhere else. There would be some thousands of years later when we invent the wheel and we can start moving. So, there was a reason we are telling that story. We're not just telling it because it's a lovely story. We're telling it because it has meaning in our life. Now, when we mustn't forget that all those stories have meaning. Everything had meanings. I know some people aren't a fan of Mircea Eliade. He was I think he was a PhD supervisor of Lincoln, who done a lot of investigation in the Indo-European myth of creation. And he was a phenomenologist, is probably the right word to call it. So he tried to practice the religion to understand it or get into it. And his view, and it's an interesting one, is that back then, everything had a purpose. In effect, you did things deliberately and it all had ritual, all had meaning. So when you started a day, there'd be a ritual about it. When you went hunting, there'd be a ritual for it. When you killed something, there'd be a ritual for it. When you cooked, there'd be a ritual for it. When you ate, there'd be a ritual for it. Everything was ritual. Everything would have had maybe a song about it, a story about it. And there was nothing autonomous in the world. You didn't just think, oh, I'm just going out for a walk now, I'll be back in a couple of hours. You had to do something with your life because, life was hard. Life is hard. But back then, life was really hard, massively so. This is part of getting back into that mindset of understanding what we've lost in modern society, with this, the nature of the year and now how separated from the land we are, and we want to get back to that, is to realise that actually, what are you doing with your time? Are you doing something useful with your time that helps you or your family, or are you just wasting it? That's part of the fame will not decay thing, but on a sort of a lower level. That
is there purpose and intent to your life, to your actions?
Yes, make sure you have an intent to do something useful, whatever useful is to your society, whether that was going hunting or cooking or something. But what he's saying is you shouldn't have, or he's saying you don't have downtime, but don't do something just for the sake of doing it. Do it for a reason. And I think that's quite interesting.
I want to touch on that. Are you familiar with the band Wadruna?
Yeah.
I saw them recently in Colorado with Tor, and at the end of the show, he made a very adamant gesture to the audience, speaking about, or it was Einar Selvik, not anything, but so he made a very adamant gesture and spoke about what you just mentioned, saying that in the ancient period, there was a song for everything, and that one of the things he would love to see is music come back to the everyday life of the people. And author that I'm reading currently, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but it's John Michael Greer. He talks about, he's an occultist, but the thing is that he talks about what the meaning of the word enchantment meant, to enchant something. And it's actually just in reference to the idea that it contains a song. Something contains a song, right? And I don't know, I just found it fascinating when you started mentioning that, that there was music, that music carried a lot of these things throughout history, the bardic cultures and all of that. It goes a long ways for us to bring enchantment back to the world, because we live in a very disenchanted society, and as I would see it. But I just think it's interesting that you bring that point up, because it's actually pretty relevant to what I'm researching right now, the music of things.
Yeah, so that's a fascinating thing. So there's a pretty book, and I wish I could remember it. And there's a book where someone interviews people from the late 19th century in a village to say what they did when they were growing up and things like that. And there were a lot of farmers back then, manual labourers, agricultural labourers, I think they were generally called. And one man who was interviewed said when he was a child, life was hard, life was miserable. All he ever did was work in the field all day. It was the most miserable existence, he said. But then he said, there was one thing, and he goes, one thing that brought joy, and that is when we went to the forge in the evening and sang songs around the fire. That brought me joy. And that was like, I thought, that was so powerful. I mean, that was powerful for a number of reasons. One, the importance of the forge even 150 years ago or 100 years ago. We sort of haven't got that anymore, like a central hub that is filled with almost magic in a way. It's like an old school temple, almost in terms of the reverence it would hold for some people. But it's very interesting that if you work hard all day and you couldn't sing, you didn't have that you wanted to do it in the evening. Obviously, they didn't have the internet, PlayStation 5s and things to go on, but that was their way. But then, I think music is an incredibly powerful thing, and I think we've ruined it. The advent of the vinyl single and the 3-minute song has actually destroyed storytelling, and now all we get is 3-minute songs which people think are amazing, but I don't want to put Bohemian Rhapsody, for example, in the sort of sacred knowledge arena, but an epic song like that versus some of Valdorina's songs. These are long songs and stories, and they are, to me, far more powerful than Kendrick Lamar dissing someone.
Well, you could say that Wagner is a interesting storyteller with his music, and it's
the operas and stuff. Yeah, absolutely. And I feel music is so underrated, and it's interesting that when we're growing up, although this may be sort of my own feeling, is that we go through the teenage years when we're growing up, and music means everything to us. I don't know about you, but I'll just listen to music all the time, and I don't get a chance to do that nowadays. I actually try and spend an hour a day actively listening to music, because we've lost that. We've lost real, so that is really interesting, the importance of music and song, and how we should use that to tell our stories if we can.
We've lost that, I can attest, that's for sure. We've become too busy, and I don't think the younger generation listens to the music at all. A couple songs here and there. Touching on that, we've done a lot of things, like you said, that's the main thing I can tell anyone about the ancient mythologies, the ancient religions. Everything was done for a purpose. And when it gets to more modern times, it seems like they kind of lost that purpose, or they just followed that tradition because they followed that tradition. So what I wanted to ask you, I know we wanted to touch on the folklore a little bit today. What do you think it was that happened then? Because when I look at it, pagan stuff, pre-Christian stuff was all for a purpose. But then when we look to the folklore, I'm thinking, I have no idea what that come from. I have no idea what the purpose for it was. So have you ever thought about that? And where do you think that came from? Do you think they just continued these traditions, or do you think they just did it on reflex for no reason?
I think this is, to understand what folklore is and myth is, and the difference is interesting. Very, very interesting. What I would say, again, this is a broad brush. I mean, I think Christianity is just LARPing paganism or heathenry, which live action role play in effect, because most of their rituals, the bread and the wine, that's a human sacrifice thing going on there. And so I don't think there's much change that. So it's more of a societal change and what's been going on. And I think myth, how could I put it? Folklore. I think it's folklore. So I was having a chat with a friend of mine, John Norman Mason, who's doing a PhD in folklore. We were trying to work out what folklore was, and I said I thought they were stories that allowed you to look at your personal fears in a kind of mirror, reflecting your personal fears, where mythology tends to reflect more world or cosmological fears, global fears. So that's I think why you have folklore too. So they're not sacred truths, but it's a way of getting stories across to teach lessons almost. Because you can't always have a trickster figure. Trickster figures are used in myth and folklore to push boundaries, break laws, create chaos, and from that, often order persists or something doesn't, and not to do it. Although what's quite interesting in the old Norse ways is that whilst Loki wasn't 100% evil, you could, although there'll be some, I'm sure, discussion about that, but he was a trickster figure, but he did cause the death of many gods, in terms of, was it Lokasenna, and then after that he got chased down and tied to the snake venom, and then from there he escaped, and that's Ragnarok for you. So here's an interesting example, but to create trickster type stories is quite hard. So I think folk tales are the easier form of that, to try and create a story that gives you some knowledge for you personally, rather than more globally. But it's really hard to define that. It's probably easier to understand particular motifs in folklore sometimes. But then the trouble with folklore is it's been so poorly documented. I mean, people talk about things like, I see YouTubers go on about the golden bough sometimes. If you've got the golden bough, burn it. It started off as one volume. Within a few years, I think Fraser had written about 12 volumes. and what were sort of thoughtful assumptions at volume 1 became, oh, this is absolute by volume 12. And he sort of think the Wicker Man is literally a sub-note he spotted in a book about something. He wrote about that, and suddenly neo-paganism wants to burn these big effigies of humans. It's used wrong. And then again, with people like Joseph Campbell and Hero with 1,000 Faces, Campbell had the idea and then creates a book around it, which isn't the right way to do academia. You get the data and then you build the book rather than have the answer and try and build a book. So to study folklore is a challenge to study, probably like studying myth as well, and studying religion. There are questions to be asked: what are the right sources to look for? And it is a real challenge on how to do that and what's changed. And I think also one of the things John Norman Mason's doing is actually talking about folklore in the modern setting, in these urban settings. Where has it gone? If you talk about folklore, it often happens in a nice magical wood, many years ago in a faraway land. Why doesn't it happen, in your, in England, in your brick house, next to your tarmac road as a juggernaut drives by full of Coca-Cola? What's going on there? So it's interesting. So it's almost like we've lost, or we can't tell new folklore. It's always, or new folklore doesn't feel like folklore because we're not really seeing it. And and that's probably enhanced by the fact that the songs we have are 3 minutes long, because that is the order of things in the world. It's all quite miserable if you think about it.
I guess I would counter with urban legends could kind of maybe fit that.
Yeah, you do get the odd urban legend, and I do love those, but do they actually really... But urban legends don't really teach you things. I mean, I was in...
maybe they fit more of the role of fairy tale.
So fairy tales are interesting because they're about tales of fairies, but people don't understand what fairies are. So fairies, if you're not familiar with it, are any being from fairyland. They're not the little things with magic wands and little wings.
Little creatures like that.
Exactly. They can be anything that has come from fairyland, whether that be a giant, a werewolf, or anything like that. So, I think they're slightly different than urban legends. I mean, I don't know. It's defining. It's an inexact science, and so to define myth or folklore or even legend is difficult. But if you're ever going to write about it, make sure you define it at the start of your book, so people know where you are. That's my top tip. I think Littleton has a good version.
It's a very poignant tip for two of us here. Thor's doing some of that for what's going on. I'm in the process of writing my own book as well. So,
yeah, there's all sorts of things. But myths tend to have sacred truths, as I mentioned. Yeah, and folklore doesn't. And folklore tends to happen on a different world, not our world.
Well, you can see it sort of disappear around the time of modern industrialization. When you see the global economic emphasis on the industries that developed around massive resource extraction, and you get the capitalist structures, not to make it political, not getting political here, but just saying that when you start to see like a global political agenda take hold and then start to then shape the lives of individuals, you see them leaving, I think, traditional processes and moving into what we have now as a modern era, where we concern ourselves with, like, our myths and folklore and everything like that have become entertainment to people these days who are trying to escape this hell world that we've created of industry and compartmentalization and just the finances for extraction of your time, basically your life for a dollar bill. And I think that you would probably see folklore disappearing as an organic model, or disappearing or not showing up organically anymore around that time, because people no longer were looking at the world the same way, and that people didn't want to engage with the world the same way or receive anything from it other than its raw essence. And then how can we change that? So we became more obsessed with our own mental development and what we could do with the world. That's what I see and what I think.
Real quick to bounce off of what Rawdas was just talking about. I kind of agree to that, because life has changed so much. So has, say, from the myths to the folklores to the, say, urban legends, as we see the music today, from this 3-minute basic trash with a beat. Before that, yes, there were some grades. Even the classicals, people had the rise and change with the heartbeat and yada yada. And then before that is us actually vocalizing a song as to the tempo of the hammer drop. You know what I mean? Like, well, we have changed so much in our evolution just of music, also with our storytelling. We don't tell stories, not at all anymore. And if so, it would be nearer to the urban legends rather than that to me is that 3-minute song. Whilst all of us around a fire, maybe whittling, making rope, like all these things, they had an intent, they had a purpose, they had a song, they had a rhythm, they had a flow that all created something beautiful, the same as more of that poetic telling of a story so long ago.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And that is one of the reasons why it's so difficult, I think, for people to try and understand what it was like to be a believer of the heathen ways 2,000 years ago, because you are now so removed today. It's really hard to get yourself in that mindset.
If I may,
and I don't really.
I was going to say, if someone was to say that they'd like to be a recreationist of said old ways, which we do hear a lot in the community, we'll just say, without breaking or committing any atrocities towards, men or fields or whatever the case may be, even animals. If somebody wanted to do their best to recreate the old ways, one would then have to live amongst nature with the seasons, to grow their own food, to practice animal husbandry, and actually get more aligned with the natural order, natural way, and natural laws of things, one would say.
Yeah, I think that would help to yes. And then you got to try and understand, why are you doing that when you do it? Because you're doing it for more than religious reasons. You're doing it because it's a life.
Right. Symbiosis with
choice.
The
and
world
then you're
itself.
probably understanding religion more back then, because religion back then wasn't about venerating Odin and Thor. Because we see that today, that everybody goes to church on a Sunday. You just didn't do that. I mean, in Hebrew, I'm thinking it wasn't like that. So just living that lifestyle, I think, may make you feel, different mentally. Although, I mean, can you survive without electricity and phones? And then do you really want to take it that far? And if not, what is the balance? And then is that balance acceptable to you? Because you will find people say, oh no, you've got to be a purist and you have to cut yourself off from the world. And some say, well, no, you should have a phone to call the emergency services if something goes wrong. So where do you balance it? And that's why it's really important to, I think, if you're going to have religious belief, you do it for you, for your reasons, and you don't follow the crowd. You may find some who have similar beliefs, but I'm pretty sure, and I've seen it myself, seen in a crowd of people, and there are extremes. Some people who think the stories in the Eddas are just fiction and they're just stories, but they like the sorts of Viking ways and with a sword or whatever, or an axe. And others really believe that Ymir was sacrificed and the world was flooded and created from his body. And so where do you fit on that spectrum? It's a challenge, and it's one of the reasons why I am not religious. In the research I do just doesn't allow it, because every story I hear, I can tell you an older story from a different culture. Their stories are not original. I can take them back, but it doesn't mean the essence of them isn't true. This is how we can trace myths, which is so important. So myths, these stories, these sacred truths do change over time. But what tends to change most are the names and the landscape they happen in, the actual detail of the myth, such as primordial twins, one sacrificed, there's a bovine, and then there's this process the world being created. That part has stayed the same for thousands of years. It's just the names have changed. There have been other little tweaks. And so that should make us feel, it doesn't, so the drivers behind the first Indo-Europeans, or even earlier, to tell that story are the same as behind those who are talking in Old Norse, or they're talking in Latin or Greek, when they have their stories. And so we mustn't, I think, get too carried away about the flavour of religion you have, providing you're a good person. I don't know how you define good person, but that's the bottom line. You're doing it for the right
I
reason.
definitely see where you're getting at. Is the story is the same, although the names and places may have been deviated from. So it's more of a based on actual events, but not necessarily. It's based on actual tales that were told long ago. And if this tale migrates with the people to and fro these different new locations, sometimes the dialects change. Sometimes the face of the said figures change. If you look at, say, the monotheistic religions today, I see a pasty white hippie on my grandmother's wall, which is cool, if she wants to, pray to that sort of a deal, by all means. But at the same time, the area where this thing originated from, the person, the physical attributes of said person would have been far different than that. The names of these, let's just say Jacob, Paul, John, these things, is highly unlikely that there was, those names in that area. But because it's extremely unlikely. But as, let's say, Roman conquest spread these things, it had to change with those places. Same as the myths when it comes to, say, the Near Eastern cultures, how they share very close similarities with the Norse, whether it went from north-south or south-north. The names, even with the Greeks, when it comes to the gods being, Mercury, Venus and Saturn, and all of these gods, they have similar in the Norse or in the Greek, such on.
Yeah, we see that the pantheon reasonably consistent in Indo-European, absolutely. And you're right. So, I do bring this up sometimes in terms of Christianity. If you go to South America and go into the churches there, Jesus is certainly not light of skin color.
I mean,
and you ought to think, well, why is the church?
Right, he's black in Africa, he's Asian in China.
Yeah, exactly. It's things change, and there's no point telling stories about deserts in Scandinavia because no one will get it. And you don't tell stories about mountains, in the plains of the steep steppes. So things change, but the core story often stays the same, and that's why we can trace myth back as well. When we can look at this core story and we can see how that changes. These are called myth themes. We call those myth themes, and we can just see how they change, and that gives us the real indication of how stories change and where they originate from. That's really key. So so it is interesting that your beliefs in terms of the sort of Old Norse or Germanic gods are very similar to the early Indo-Europeans, even though the names are different and the landscape's different and some things are different. But does that mean what you're practicing is better than them or worse? That's a conversation you guys have to have, because and
then that gets right back into, say, the shared faith of Christianity, regardless of the pigment of said Jesus. Irrelevant as long as you're doing your best to live with, good intent, help the fellow man and such on, right?
There's there's 1,700 different types of Christian church. I don't know. It just goes to show and there are various versions of heathenry. Absolutely. You see it. So, and it's like, does it matter? Can't you just get down to why are you religious?
Get back to celebrating nature.
And get back to roots, get back to the world, and get back to actually, let's all look after this world, put back into it what we take out. And to me, as a non-religious person, that seems like a marvellous idea. I can buy into that.
Right. And regardless of someone's faith or religion or such on, that's a pretty good idea for all of us to do. We share this planet. So it would be kind of wise of us all to care a bit for it and such.
Yeah. Are we getting to a point? I'm sorry. Are we getting to a point where you need to go, John, or how are we doing?
I'm wide awake. I think the tea has certainly hit me. So you've got me for at least another 30 minutes if you want it. I don't know if you've got random questions to ask or.
Yes, I've got to head out soon. But I was wanted to give you one last shout out, one more promotion for your data. What was it called again? The Mythology
and Folklore database.
Mythology and Folklore database, and what we were just speaking about, tracing this myth back. You said how many? There was 2,000 or more stories in there.
200,000.
200,000.
Okay, even more so. So that's a monumental task, right?
Just a quick
thinking there's there's AI software that might be able to link those together. But yeah, but one last question.
I'm working on that.
Yeah. That's a great.
This is
that,
John's
that's
website right
immediately
here.
what I thought. They might be able to do a much better job at sorting through all that. But what is it that you're looking for, or so far, or what it is? How is it that you're kind of sorting through that and trying to trace these myths back from all over the world, and even from completely unrelated cultures?
What am I looking for? That's a really good question, Tor.
Besides the similarities, of course, and we look at the migration patterns, of course, but is there like certain patterns that you're looking for, or if you had an AI software that you could give a prompt,
which I have, I've got AI, but it's still not clear. AI isn't good enough to look at.
Not quite there yet, but maybe soon. If you could give it a prompt, what kinds of things would you tell it to look for?
I don't know, because I'm not doing this for me anymore. When I first started this off, my first question was Jesus real? Which is a whole, I just want to go, I couldn't understand why we worship a chap there's no evidence of. That's what I started sort of some of this. But now I can just look at the data and it just snaps to me. I can look at the distributions and get a good idea of what's going on. So there's nothing in there. I just want the data to be cleaner and better. I've still got 30,000 errors in it. So what if I had an AI, I'd say, could you please fix the 30,000 errors where the Russians have misspelt different traditions 30,000 ways? Because that would make my job a lot easier. And then we've got data I can share. I mean, so at the moment if you're interested, and if you're not, I'm going to tell you anyway. At the moment the data is split by motif. So there's a story type, and we've got all the narratives in that. I'm splitting those into individual narratives, and by doing that means you can do some fantastic things like analyze each narrative and see particular traits of those narratives. We can look at for particular words in individual narratives and map those out if particular gods or creatures or instances of a particular verbiage appear. We can look that they may appear elsewhere, so we can maybe be able to see different motifs. And that is because when we categorize myths into a motif, that is a lie, in the sense that those myths may not have been written to match that motif. They were written for a particular purpose, and we've just decided to think actually they look the same, so we put them in that box. And that may introduce issues which we're unaware of because those myths weren't meant to be about that. So, if I had AI fix 30,000 errors and allow the individual narratives to come out, and then, I could create so much data, so much analytics, and it'd probably be really happy. And there will be a facility to allow people to submit folklore and myths they know that aren't in the database themselves soon at that point.
Yeah, like a
Probably not the answer you want.
Wikipedia for mythology on steroids. Well, that's great.
Yeah. Absolutely,
yeah.
Yes.
Really look forward to see where that goes. That could be some
thank you.
very interesting stuff.
Do you have anything on the, what are they called, the Nart tales and sagas in there?
Yeah, not will be in there by Black Sea. There'll be a few in there. I don't know if they're actually known as the Nart in there, but if not, I do. So I've my own personal
database a little bit. It's been great, by the way. It's been very useful for my research.
Thank you. Yeah, so I will. I've got a huge library which I want to digitize. That's something I can do to it. Is, AI, could you please get my books that haven't ever been digitized? Because that's the trouble with myth books. Many of them are only in print, and digitize them for me perfectly and put them in the database. And now I've got a load of Nart myths. I've got a few books specifically on those that I'd love to add. But there's so many stories I want to add and go, and you have to get down into a finer level of granularity of data. That it's, if I could tell you myths or folk tales from particular towns, maybe in the United States or England, that could be really interesting, especially for more modern tales about, let's say, things like witchcraft or vampires and werewolves. That would be very interesting.
Indeed, I definitely agree. Well, I would go ahead.
I was going to say, I would like to say, maybe because I think we're getting to a closing point, but I wanted to just, I'm obviously kind of like the bigger woo hippie here in the group in a way. I love to try to like tie things in with like a spiritual or like, some sort of cosmic or amazing, unknowable thing, right? But I mentioned earlier in the podcast that I named my son after cycles and all of that, right? And as much as there's cycles in history, I believe there's also patterns as well that repeat themselves and continue. And it's just something that keeps going. And today we actually took my son to go get his name, social security, all that stuff, like finally, because we did a home birth, we had to go register him. And we were debating, like, do we want to go with this name? Do we want to go with this name? You know, is there been something that could bring validity to that? And what I had named him was Yera, which is the Norse J rune, which means just that. It means cycles and incompletion. And I chose that because my father's name was Jay. And he had died previously before, like right before my baby was born. And to me, it showed in everything that you talked about here, and the justifications and why I chose that name for my son have been completely verified and validated. And I just think, like, you know, today I was just sitting here thinking, like, should I go with this name? You know, it's gonna be hard for him to describe, but it's so with everything that you told me, it's quite validating, and really has me set and confirmed and glad that I had chose that, because you gave me a lot of perspective that I just didn't have before, and really enriched how I thought about it. So yeah, I just want to say I really, really appreciate everything that you shared here today. And I'm going to definitely be diving into your Indo-European and Yamnaya stories on your channel. I thought
we only just touched the surface of a creation myth. We haven't.
I know, but it was interesting how cyclical it worked out today. My thoughts, and then meeting with you today, I just thought that was really, really incredible.
Yeah. Well, please, thank you for that.
Of course.
With that, does anybody else have anything else to say before I go ahead and close this one out? Awesome. Well, Jon, it has truly been a pleasure having you here today. I wouldn't be surprised if we reach back out to you in the near future or whatnot to have you back on again. Your knowledge and attentiveness to all these different things is more than appreciated. Now, I know by more than just myself, but our viewers as well. If you don't mind, we'll also see about dropping a link down below to see if we can promote some of the things that you have going on. And if any of our guests or our viewers would like to go ahead and drop a comment or anything down below, anybody that you might like to see us bring on in the future, by all means. Thank you.
Yeah, check out Jon.
Absolutely.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right. And Jon, if you would like us to have anything at or the beginning, maybe a link to your mythology folklore or something like that, just email us. We'd be glad to link have a little title card that, you know, shows your logo and you know, really lets everyone know where to go to find more of your knowledge.
Yeah, I can send you one biographic if you want, but I'm not fussed. I'm not.
No.
I'm pretty chilled with life. But to all of you want to get in touch, you know, individually, you've got questions or you want to talk. Yeah, I love talking about these things and understanding how others think and sharing knowledge. And yeah.
I've got your email. Expect one from me. I think the 5th chapter of my book I'd really like to send you before I print it, just to get just to see what you think. I think it's about sacrifice. Whole chapter, everything we have about sacrifice in Norse and European. So I think that would be that, and maybe a couple other chapters too. But that one for sure I'll send over to you.
No problem. I'll do that. Yeah, for other authors. So that's no problem at all.
Gentlemen, I'm signing off.
Yes,
my wife will cut me if I don't get out and help with the
much.
baby. So appreciate seeing all of you again.
Take care, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Yep. Might potentially reach out to you at some point. I'm working on trying to develop a channel similar to combining like the Norse and the Celtic histories and spiritualities into a modern idea, to where we can look at what they believed in an animistic sense without doing the reconstructive work that we talked about here in this episode. Like, how can we actually take general, when I say spiritual, usually referring to something like with just a relationship to the land in a way. So I'm working on a channel taking these histories and trying to create sort of a guideline for people on how they can live more animistic lives through these lenses. So yeah, I mean, in the future, maybe I might have an option, reach out to you and we can talk about some of the histories and how people might have actually just lived in those days.
Yeah. Just email me or WhatsApp me or whatever. I'm more than happy to talk to anyone, really. I'm very flexible.
I'll try to get you.
You have no idea how many things I want to talk to you about.
That's it. I'm happy to have one-on-one video chats if you want. If you need that, an hour to talk about stuff. I love talking about this stuff and learning.
I might
more.
even do that. I might even do that with some of the Celtic histories if you're interested in just, talking about some of the
I'll
things.
be interested in what you mean by Celtic history. That could take us an hour.
I know, right? Which part? Yeah.
What do you
Where
mean
are we
by
going?
Celtic? Oh, yeah, there we go. But yeah. So to all of you,
You mentioned something that was interesting, John, and I didn't want to bring it up during the main portion of things on purpose because it was way different than what the rest of the stuff we were talking about was. It had to do with your original inquiry for what started
Oh,
all,
yes.
aka trying to find whether Jesus Christ was real or not.
That one, yes.
I played that game as well, let's put it that way. And that was one of the things I was trying to discern for myself. And one of the things, and I'm not saying that there is truth to it, but I'm saying I have come up with a plausible historical figure, but only by completely and utterly ignoring the collective wisdom, let's say, of the dates that of putting Christ being around for his ministry, let's say, or his, his lectures and that kind of stuff, if there was a historical person in the feast AD, which is what most of the historical timeline is given for. I don't see any evidence actually that supports that timeline whatsoever. I see a lot of justification, a lot of guesswork. I see certain things that could be there that could, rather than are with it if you find anything with it. And so if the timeline's wrong, like our understanding of the timeline, then suddenly it's going to be impossible to find a historical person at all. Even if you push it, say 30 years, either direction and whatnot, you're not going to be able to find that person as easily for what's happening on that particular front. If there is a person, I'm not saying there is, just to be clear. But when I played that game, and I did not come with any preconceived notions of having attached that particular timeline that's been given, and that kind of thing with it, suddenly a lot of new possibilities opened up to me. And I took a different approach. I didn't try to find Jesus himself, if you will, because I figured that might be too much of a monumental task. So if I'm trying to find Hitler, as an example, and that kind of stuff, and take him out and whatnot, he might be too much hidden stuff due to propaganda from the church or from other people that are getting into it, or just from loss of time, or people having so many different conflicting views on this particular thing with it, because we know that there were so many different groups of people that came and sprang from the notion of Christianity, like the various different Gnostic groups, etc., that popped up from it, that instead I decided to try to find some of the people that were closest to his inner circle and see if I could place them inside of the historical context, and then if that would lead to him, so to speak.
Gotta go. See you guys.
Okay, yeah, take
All
care.
right.
Thank you, John.
So by playing that game, I found at least I'm not saying it's true, but a possible historical character for what was going on with it. And it's been a very interesting thing with it, because it's very different from the biblical version, but there are still trace elements of the biblical version of it. And I started to strip away things that I knew were purely mythologically based, so to speak, from that, meaning from the Bible itself, and focus only what was more of what could be done by an actual human being, so to speak there. Yeah, it was fun. I'm not saying I have any definitive answers for what it is, but it gave me a completely different look at things and whatnot.
Interesting. Yeah. No, I don't. Despite most academics thinking he was real, I think there's too much confirmation bias in that. And I just don't think his story is too perfect to be real. His story must be made up because it is so perfect.
The story is absolutely made up, but that doesn't mean it wasn't inspired by a real person.
Yeah, but it could be inspired. Many different people, because there have been many dying and rising gods.
Yeah, I'm aware of at least 40 something personally.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but that's that. But just studying that leads you into a whole world of religious thought that people had in Europe that I was unaware of. It's good to broaden your mind to understand there are people out there that believe some mighty strange things.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it and whatnot. That's part of the reason why I consider myself I guess you could say spiritual, but not religious in any way, shape, or form. I don't particularly follow any particular like religious doctrine or creed. So that way you know where my biases are, since I already know that you're not religious either in that particular regard for it. In that case, I take it to mean that you are someone who's very scientifically minded. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that particular front, because you mentioned that you're not someone of faith.
I'm academic, yes. I'm very logical. Yeah.
So, I don't see it, and maybe you won't necessarily agree with that, but I don't see a contradiction between that being spiritual and very scientifically minded. If you,
You could be, as I say, there are aspects to the Indo-European religion I can empathise with, and I would like to feel a part of if we could recreate those.
yeah, I get where you're coming from with that. Yeah. Anyway, no, I just thought it was very interesting that you took a very similar journey, if you will, that led you to do some of this stuff. That's all I was commenting on.
Okay. Well, thank you.
All right, I gotta head out too then.
That's okay.
Thank you again. Thank you
Point.
for staying up late for us, and we'll
No problem at all.
I'll
Always great to
email
talk.
again soon.
I hope you did really enjoy it, and hopefully
I had a great
time.
time. I hope you did too.
I'm more than happy to come back if you want me on to talk about, let's say, because there's
Actually
50 other myths we need to
your
go.
interview with him on the Skaldic archives before that, went away and
about
whatnot.
2 years ago.
I found you.
That was so interesting. I really thought we were going to talk like again about 100 times because there was so much.
Could do a daily podcast and never run out of things to talk about. All right.
All right. Good night, both of you. Take care.